Gudde Moien and welcome to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if Rome industrialized. There is no consensus on certain points. The main one is slavery. Now, we all know that slavery was important back then on an economic perspective, and that a slaveless Roman society is nearly impossible. However, if we check the US, for instance, we saw that even a country with many slaves could successfully industrialize. And the US is just one of many countries. Also, the climate of Rome and the US is very similar in that aspect. There is no clear point of divergence in here in this scenario. It is not going to be an ASB scenario, and I will make sure that everything will seem plausible. I will focus first of all on three aspects. The first one being slavery, the second one being the science of that time, and the third point would be the technology, so how it would be applied. Later on, I will also present a big fourth point where I will depict how everything will add up and slowly change Rome as such. So, the first point, slavery. Slave rebellions happened very frequently, and it was nothing new. There were many slave rebellions. But let's say that Spartacus would have some success. Now, we all know that Spartacus was not someone who wanted to abolish slavery, and it is unclear whether he actually had the plan to overthrow or burn Rome or just to escape. He would somehow ally with Mithridates. Mithridates at that time was the king of an empire which had a long-lasting war with Rome. And once Spartacus and Mithridates would be able to somehow ally, butterflies would certainly occur. But for the sake of this scenario, Rome will stay and expand similarly as it did in OTL and have similar problems as in OTL. Spartacus would at the end not be very successful because that would be almost impossible. But with more damage, the elite and certain other Romans would be more divided over the issue of slavery. At first, there would be a bigger move to repress slaves kind of strong, but over many decades to come, one philosophical current would observe the situations of the slaves, and probably some radicals within that current would suggest a slaveless society. But of course from a Roman perspective. Slavery would still be there for the decades to come, but the Senate would start to agree that repression would not really help, and that such uprisings were too risky for the stability of Rome. Slowly but surely reforms would be made to abolish, from a Roman perspective again, slavery. So those slaves would probably be those that were speaking Latin, or maybe slaves from the Hellenic world, or slaves that were considered from non-barbaric countries or peoples. It certainly will not include, though, prisoners of war. The prisoners of war would be used in such scenarios in camps or gulag-like structures to perform hard labor, which in OTL is considered inhumane, but would be acceptable for Roman society in that time. Not only would this open up a huge percentage of future workers, but it would become also a model for future factories. In that sense, that those camps and gulag-like structures would serve in a way as this type of model. So now we have two very important aspects for an upcoming industrialization. We have a model for certain factory work or mechanization, and also automatization, and also we have a huge percentage of people who can later on work in those factories. Secondly, we have famous people such as Ctesibius, Vitruvius, and Theron of Alexandria. Ctesibius was a Greek inventor and mathematician who lived around 285 to 222 BC. He was apparently the first head of the Museum of Alexandria and invented many things, which we today take as granted. There we have the counterweight adjustable mirror, hydraulics, a water organ, the water clock, force pumps, and perhaps also the yellow pail. Vitruvius lived between 80 or 70 until 15 BC. He was an important Roman author and engineer working for the military especially. By his own description, Vitruvius served as an artilleryman, the third class of arms in the military offices. He probably served as a senior officer of artillery in charge of doctores ballistarum, artillery experts, and libratores, who actually operated the machines. Now this part here is a very important one. Moreover, he also described central heating, the watering machines, materials, and other machines. And if for some reason he would have the idea to implement some of Ctesibius' ideas into the military, he would see the implementation of the yellow pail within the military. Then we have Hieron of Alexandria, who lived from 10 until 70 AD. Egypt at that time was part of Rome, and if Rome still conquers Egypt, he would thus be an interesting person for Rome and its military. He is credited to have built the actual yellow pail, but his works are mostly based off the works of Ctesibius, and he also created many other important machines or inventions, such as the first vending machine, the wind wheel, a standalone fountain, mechanisms for the Greek theater, programmable cart that was powered by a falling weight, and an odometer-like device. His inventions were for centuries unmatched, and if Rome would adopt an early version of the yellow pail in their military, they could invent better steam engines with the help of Hieron of Alexandria, not only for ships but also for other areas, which we are going to describe in the next part. Now, thirdly, we have the application of the technology. As I said before, most of the technology would have to be applied to the military. Rome lived from conquest and needed to expand fairly often. With Vitruvius, the Romans had a very observant person, and it is very possible that he was not an exception. People like him could push the military to use it for their artillery, where catapults could perhaps have some steam engine with them. Not just that, an early steam engine might be also interesting to push other things, such as armory, weapons, or supplies. Surely horses, they will not be replaced, but it is very possible that a steam engine is more seen like as another part to add to the Roman army to make them more efficient. The military is always one of the main pioneers if it comes to technological advancements, and we can be sure that the Romans would develop it further. Troop movements are also important for the Romans as well as communication. And that's where the steam technology would be interesting too for them. The Romans already used the hypocaust to warm their houses, but it's very likely that for bigger houses, especially for the rich elite, the steam technology would come in handy to be adapted in a convenient way. Especially in places where certain resources are difficult to find, that's where this technology would come in handy as well as in places with harsh winters. Then, of course, mining. Romans needed more iron in order to build the steam engines or parts of it. They wanted also more silver for their economy and would probably also by then discover how to use charcoal in a better way. Due to the fact that many slaves were freed, they could work as laborers in those mines. However, it is very likely that later on the prisoners of war, they would take on this task, as once the Romans would discover that people get fairly sick in those mines, and they would probably prefer that some prisoners would rather die than their own citizens. Overall, how would an industrialized Rome look like? And how could it develop even further? I'm going to tackle this point. How could it develop even further? Through literacy and education. Christianity or any other similar religion would come in handy for multiple reasons. If Christianity pops up, of course, it would seriously help increasing the literacy of the Romans, and in order to keep in touch with certain groups of people, like let's say people who have the same religion as you, letter exchange would become important, thus literacy is needed, and with such a big motivation, literacy would eventually go up, which in return could help some people to get literate and understand some new ideas. Thus, the spread of technology could be even more advanced. At first, papyrus would be enough, but eventually once China discovers paper and the Roman person would hear about it or find out about it, there would be an initiative to spread paper to the Roman Empire as well. Also, seals and engraved gems were well known in this time, so it's very likely that with an increase of literacy, a Roman person might invent a printing process. The tools, they were already there, it just needed someone or a person who could actually add up all of this puzzle into one singular thing. This would seriously lead to an explosion of not only literacy but also education in general. Once people would be able to read, new ideas could spread faster and progress could be made in many areas. It could also spark social changes. It's not without any reason that some historians claim that the printing press was the main reason why the Reformation in the Church happened, and thus Protestantism. As for education, the Romans would take these improvements for granted at first, and only much later would they recognize that education is necessary to further develop specific groups of people who could invent new technology and implement them again. Perhaps one of Rome's concurrents would be able to do that beforehand. So let's say that perhaps Parthia or India or maybe China, they would be able to do that. Railways. The railways would surely appear due to the fact that the Romans supported road construction in OTL, and because the railways would be the next logical step in case of an industrialization. Improvements in infrastructure and transportation speed that is unique to the Romans would give them a military advantage that could work to undo many major issues with Roman governments. For instance, the need for the emperor to be everywhere at once on the border. So the emperor needed to know certain things or certain stuff that happened, because without this, he would not be able to do a decision. So thus, there were a lot of problems with the defense. Of course, this is more in a scenario where we still suppose that Rome becomes an empire, but the same could apply also for, let's say, a senate or any dictatorship or any kind of form of more authoritarian republic. A fortified rail line along the border or deep enough to be secure as part of military rail network means that the emperor or the ruler of Rome and his generals can move much faster than in OTL, making it easier to respond thus to threats. Combined with improved productivity, enabling more troops to be recruited and faster deployment times, Rome is in a great position. The engineering corps that built the rail lines can do the same to bring Roman authority to far-reaching locations, in Germany for instance, and so on. Railway-connected seed colonies can form the backbone of new territories, where the excess population not engaged in now mechanized tasks can be used to set up a colonia. The weakness will always be the railways themselves, but increased mechanization means more troops can be hired and deployed, but after taking control of population centers, I can't imagine it would be a significant problem. But with Roman strategies for population distribution, industrial advantage and access to some of the richest coal supplies in the world, the Romans could easily reach the Vistula, after which to expand further east requires changes in strategy. Armies designed for the steppe, for the Baltics, and the empire could do a Russia and use the railways to expand ever eastwards. I think this would still lead to a capital in Constantinople, only because it is closer to the eastern territories, whilst the west is accessible by steamship and rail. But it could well lead to an empire that rules from Hibernia through Central Asia. I can see the Hindu Kush, Tian Shan, and the Sahara deserts being the extreme natural borders of this empire. I'm kinda unsure of the time frames, but unless the Roman enemies can establish infrastructure and industry to compete, China, Arabia, and India are all I can see that could halt them, and that is because of their brilliant natural defenses. So they have mountains, deserts, and again, other bigger mountains that play to their advantage. So now there is also a change that would appear if the industrialization is still keeping and going on for some decades or even centuries. And one of these changes is this environmental damage that would be far more immediate and obvious than global warming. The Romans may have been very pro-hygiene, yes, but unless this cultural trait manages to overcome greed for profit, you're going to get a lot of factories spewing out fumes near major population centers. So this will mean that many people will start to get sick. And depending on how factory workers are treated, they could have very high mortality rates that may have been unsustainable for population at that time. Combine this with landslides caused by industrial scale mining, and you have a period that would be very unpleasant to live in. So again, this would be a huge cocktail which could just scream out some more revolutions. The second one is the Imperial Overstretch. If the Romans are not able to overcome their lust for conquest, they may use their new tech to create new weapons that render the old one again obsolete. Invading the Parthians would probably be a popular move for a Roman leader to make, because after all, Parthia is seen as some kind of Persia, and the Romans, being influenced by the Greeks, could see this as a very popular thing to do, to fend off someone who is equal in strength and to finally show them that they are the number one. And then after that, why shouldn't they just go to India? And why not China? So even though there are these natural borders, you may find some Roman leader who would highly estimate himself and the capacities of Rome, and maybe there would be also a current to take control of the known world. However, colonization in the Americas would very likely not happen at all. Maybe only much later. The third one is competition. So before the Romans would be able to conquer all their concurrents, the Parthians or the Chinese could learn about this Roman technology and use it in their countries. They could actually even improve certain technologies, and this is something that happens quite often, even nowadays. So the Romans would see this as a terrible thing. They would think that their enemies are catching up. So what would this mean? Well, it would be in one way good for the Romans, because this would motivate them to even more develop their own technology, and it would keep this competitiveness. They would also finally now see that education is an important thing, and they would try to give a bigger support to education by that moment. Economic competition may force them to improve as well, so that their goods and what they export can be still very innovative, so innovative enough that people still want to have it. But there is also this other part where actually developing trade with rival powers may also promote peace between the empires. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Althistory.